I asked Kirsten to come in. In marketing, for example, before Kirsten comes on, there's this concept of a guerrilla marketing, right? Where you have you strike in unpredictable moments in order to sell your product. So I think this is the kind of freedom maybe a freelance journalist has. So Kirsten, can you comment?
Yeah, I think as a freelancer, I have more freedom to kind of choose the sort of stories I do, the sort of things. So I'm not being necessarily signed by an editor to, you know, today go and cover this, today go and cover that, which sometimes happens, not very often. So I get more freedom to kind of choose what I want. But then at the same time, we cannot depend on freelancers like me to fill the gap of daily news coverage. You don't have, you know, it's such a big operation. The amount of the daily news that you see printed in the newspaper is only a portion of the work that the journalists actually do to produce that. You know, for every interview that makes it in the paper, there might be other people that talk to that they've not quoted, people they've spoken to on background, events they went to, and only like 1 hour I just spent the whole afternoon here. So like as a freelancer, I don't have the time and the capacity to do that kind of news coverage, right? And it's not a Singapore problem. Like globally, there's very similar questions, especially like in bigger countries, but local news reporting, right? The thing of local news reporting, you can't depend on individual freelancers to report on municipal matters in like small town Wales, or you know everyone's clustering in the UK on Westminster, but it used to be really valuable journalism that small town journalists would go and sit in the town councils and the town halls, and that sort of reporting is now gutted, and that's gutting communities because they don't have information what's happening in their own backyard. So that's a big thing. But I think today I'll talk about like the experience of being a freelancer. I think we talk a lot about the culture of fear, but I think one thing journalists definitely talk about when we meet each other, but don't talk a lot about, is also what I find to be increasingly a culture of pettiness and tedium, which is that lack of press freedom doesn't just affect the way that journalists work, it affects the ecosystem. I think it changes expectations from journalists and the public, but also people work with journalists, right? So for example, the way that government call people, you know, they work on this principle that the government needs to be accountable and transparent to people, therefore we should respond to journalist inquiries. It's more like journalists beg you to give us, can you give us this data, that data, and it's actually very difficult to get information. So as a freelancer, I think these are some of the realities. So like TOC, I do not get media accreditation from the Ministry of Information. It's not necessarily a big problem, but it brings in a lot of inconvenience. So for like if you cover court cases, a freelancer like me is not allowed to sit in a media gallery. So I can't just come in and out of court and sit in a media gallery. My laptop, I have to queue in the public gallery with everybody else. If the public gallery can't get in, I do not get to join in on press huddles. Like, so if the AGC press officer is doing a briefing to the press, they only do it to accredited media. I have been in press huddles. I was kicked out because they said I didn't have accreditation. I do not get the press releases. I do not get the invite to the press conferences. Usually this is not a huge problem because as a freelancer, I don't really do breaking news in the same way. So, you know, if you get a bit, the Straits Times will carry it all for you and then you pick it up off the Facebook post or the government's release, or this is what the mainstream media is for. But then the daily sort of regular interactions with government offices, government can be very frustrating and really affect the journalism that can be done. So if most of the time they're not replying to you at all, and you're getting stonewalled, and there's no freedom of information legislation that you can apply to require them to give you information, then it is very difficult for certain stories to be told, right? It's very difficult to get data. And a lot of journalists have a lot of different stories about really kind of quite ludicrous experiences. So for example, one experience I've had was, I was doing a story about migrant workers and the labor court. And the story was basically that migrant workers were going to labor disputes. Even if the labor court ruled in their favor, there wasn't a lot of power that they had to enforce this ruling. So if you win the labor court, your employer still won't pay you. The migrant worker only has a 2-week visa left. And if in that time the employer doesn't pay you, you get repatriated, and then you can't really do anything, right? So I wrote labor court, labor court email, and I said, what do you have to say about all these problems? NGOs are, pointing out that there are all these troubles. What processes does the labor court have to ensure that the employers are blah, blah, blah. And then for quite a while, I think it was 1 or 2 weeks. And then the response was, they sent me a PDF brochure to bring my IC to MOM to lodge a labor court claim. So they basically just sent me their real press public collateral of how to lodge a labor court claim. It's not what I asked, right? Like I often sending questions, I don't get an answer, or if I do get an answer, it doesn't actually answer my question. Like I wrote in and asked, what does Singapore legally mandate that domestic workers live in the house? The answer was, a lot of countries legally mandate domestic workers to live in the house, which is not what I asked. I get that all the time. The most honest one I had was a government comms officer who, after he received my questions in email, called me and said, to be very honest with you, I will not get clearance to answer your questions from my superiors, but I'm very sorry. So I piled all the press statements that I could find from our minister that tangentially relates to your question, and hopefully you can extrapolate information from there. And that was the best he could do, and that was what I appreciated. At least he was upfront about why, right? But this is very much telling of the sort of relationship, right? That government comms officers are not used to being pushed or feeling like they are obliged to be transparent and accountable. So the relationship that they have power and you are begging for information, and not that their job as officers is to facilitate this communication with the public and the media. And it's very difficult to do things. And as a freelancer, can still just write, the government declined to respond. Or increasingly, what I do is I just include my story, the questions I sent, and then the lack of response, to be transparent about just what happens. But what I do hear from various publications, that sometimes if you don't get a response from the government, the editor becomes very wary of writing story, because they're afraid they will then later be accused of not getting the government's side of the story, having a biased story, not being fair. And so that becomes one indirect way to kill a story. So you don't have to censor it, you just don't, and then sometimes the publication will not run a story because they cannot get a response from you. Things that have happened is if you write for the foreign press like I do, you sometimes get the ambassador countries writing letters to the editor, which I think it's really they write a letter to the New York Times or to Foreign Policy. I'm not sure that they are expecting the reader of the New York Times or Foreign Policy magazine to really be convinced, but it's for domestic Singaporeans to see the Singapore government is rebutting these claims. And you can tell it's the case because if that publication will not carry your letter in full, MFA will publish the letter and Straits Times publish the letter, and the letter itself will become a news item of coverage to rebut your story in whatever foreign press it is. There are situations, unlike other countries, Singapore does not have a strong association of journalists, local or foreign correspondents, to talk about things like press freedom. So unlike Hong Kong, where there's a foreign correspondence club that will issue statements about press freedom and will host, lunch talks or conferences that sometimes the Hong Kong government is very unhappy about. Singapore does not have something like that. We have a Foreign Correspondents Association. We also have a press club, which I've been informed is also a club. But they don't do work about press freedom, we can see. So we have this sort of entire environment where even the foreign journalists who write for publications uncontrolled like the Straits Times also have an eye on self-censorship because they are worried about their visas. And it's quite, I'm not happy about it, but it's understandable, right? Like foreign journalists have sent me of different postings that we get in different countries. It's a good place to be a correspondent. It's a comfortable life. If you have kids, they go to good schools. It's a very stable and safe place. It's a good base of stories in Southeast Asia. So I don't want to get kicked out of Singapore. And that affects the sort of stories that they write about Singapore. And I think, they try very hard, but they always have, you always kind of worry about that. So it's not just Singaporean journalists who are worried, foreign journalists are worried as well. So I think that's kind of the reality, like I think I do worry, Terry, that you do kind of get a sense that every time someone knocks on your door, only two possibilities, right? It's either Foodpanda or it's police. And you kind of you kind of live that with that sort of paranoia. But a lot of the regular stuff.
Thanks, Kirsten. I think we're running out of time. We've only about 8 minutes left